two lectures on the same subject on the same day, but I could not help it. So, so please feel free to interrupt me if you have to interrupt me. So I like to continue where I left off in the morning, and morning basically we were looking at the cases like 2-photon entanglement and 4-photon entanglement, and we were looking at the coincidence counts. However, the coincidence counts are quite small, and if you want to increase the coincidence counts, then you have to increase the gain of your nonlinear medium, and you can increase the gain of the nonlinear medium by pumping it harder and harder, but you don't have infinitely stronger lasers at the wavelengths required for the nonlinear crystal. So there are limitations, and one way to overcome these limitations is to make use of both stimulated emission as well as the spontaneous emission processes in the down converter. Most people in quantum optics operate their down converters in the spontaneous regime, whereas classical down converters have been operated in the stimulated regime. And it turns out that if you operate your down converter, this down converter, in a regime which is a combination of both stimulated and the down conversion processes, it leads to number of advantages. So for the stimulated case, what you do is that you have the pump, and the pump converts into 2 photons, signal and the idler. Now you drive the down converter both by the signal photons as well as the idler photons. So in addition to pump, when you want to take care of the stimulated processes, want to use the stimulated processes in the down converter, you apply additional lasers at the signal and the idler frequencies. So in that case, you would have both stimulated emission and the spontaneously generated down converted photons. And this leads to several advantages, both in terms of the counting rate. You can increase the counting rate by several orders of magnitude, and that's a great advantage as far as the experiment is concerned. And not only that, you can also improve the visibility of your signal quite considerably. So I will not give you much details of this, just show you the behavior of the visibility. If you look at this dashed curve, so this is the visibility of the 2-photon coincidence count. And if you are in the regime of very small g, very low gain, the visibility is 100%. So our calculations actually showed that for the case of parametric down converter in the spontaneous regime, as you increase the gain of the amplifier, the visibility drops considerably. But on the other hand, you would like to have a good 2-photon counting signal. If you would like to have a good 2-photon counting signal, you better work in the regime of higher G. But if you work in the regime of higher G, you have good 2-photon counting signal, but the visibility goes down. So actually this kind of behavior has been verified by De Martini's group in Rome. this exactly they saw this behavior as displayed here by the dashed curve. Now on the other hand, if you use the stimulated processes along with the spontaneous processes, that is, you take these to be driven by both signal at both the signal and the idler frequencies, then this is the behavior of the visibility. And you see, you can have visibilities which could be more than 80% if you include the stimulated processes along with the spontaneous processes. So there is a tremendous advantage if in these kind of problems you use the stimulated processes along with the spontaneous processes. Not only you increase the 2-photon counting rate, but you also increase the visibility significantly. So kind of experimental challenges which you have with very small g, both can be overcome by using the stimulated processes as well. Okay. So now I like to describe to you some work that we have done with Jonathan Dowling. He sent one of his students to work with me, Bill Plick, and we have such an active collaboration with Jonathan Dowling that he is going to send 2 more students to work with me for a couple of months. So now I like to describe to you a new class of interferometers, and the idea originally was introduced by John Clowder, Sam McCall, and Bernie Yorke, and they termed these as the SU11 interferometers, and the reason being that the traditional Mach-Zehnder interferometer, which I described to you in the morning, that mathematically corresponds to an SU2 interferometer, because I explained to you in the morning that the interferometer basically performs a rotation. I wrote down a term e to the power I phi s g, and I said interferometer typically is represented by this. So those kind of interferometers all belong to SU2 class, and what McCall et al. Introduced is what they call the SU11 interferometer, and the idea is the following, that here you have a down converter, and so the pump comes, you generate the signal and the idler. Okay, forget about this part for the time being, just think of the spontaneous process. So from this pump you generate a signal and the idler, and there is some phase object. So this signal and idler beam signal beam, let's say, passes through the phase object, and then you have another down converter, and now in between you shift the phase of this pump by pi. So the second OPA is pumped by the same pump, but it differs in phase by pi. And then you look at the outputs here with these 2 detectors. Now notice again the way the interferometer is set up, that if phi were 0, then there would be no signal, because what happens, that this, like what I did in the morning, that U and U dagger cancel each other. Same way for this particular problem, because I have one down converter and the another down converter, and the relative phase of the pump which pumps these 2 down converters is out of phase by pi, and therefore effectively nothing will happen unless there is a phase object here in the interferometer. And this class of interferometer is called SU11 because what the down converter does is that if you have the inputs A and B, the output is like something like a cos hyperbolic G times A plus some e to the power I theta sine hyperbolic G B dagger. So this kind of a transformation which is typical of a down converter, that is known in the literature as the Bogoliubov transformation, and is typical of the problems where the dynamical evolution corresponds to the SU11 group. And that is the reason that this interferometer was termed as the SU11 interferometer. So now we can ask the question that what is the sensitivity of such an interferometer, and whether under certain conditions the SU11 interferometer can yield Heisenberg limited sensitivity. Now, let me also mention that people who work with the quantum communications, telecom community, they are getting interested in quantum communications, and the quantum communication community is talking of similar class of interferometers, and in their community the OPA, each of the OPA is replaced by what the community calls as the phase sensitive amplifiers. And phase sensitive amplifiers worked on Kerr nonlinearities, and in optical fibers, if the fibers are long enough, the effective Kerr nonlinearity becomes large. So there are usages of these kind of SU11 interferometers in the context of quantum communications using optical fibers. Okay. So we can now look at the sensitivity of such interferometers, and what actually we did, we said, okay, at the same time let's also put a driving field here on these two ports, so that we have both stimulated emission and the spontaneous emission in the system, and we examine the sensitivity. So first we have to decide that what is the signal that we are going to measure for this problem. And the signal for this problem is the number of photons at this detector and the number of photons at this detector, and we look at the total number of photons at these two detectors. That is the signal. And there is a mathematical reason why we look at this kind of quantity, this kind of observable as the signal, and that has to do with the SU11 evolution, which is the underlying evolution for this system. So that's the signal, the observable corresponding to the signal, and we can define the sensitivity as I defined in the morning, noise term divided by the derivative of the signal. And now it turns out that this delta phi can be written in this form, where, well, this R and G are the same thing. The R is the gain of the amplifier. R is also known as the squeezing parameter in the quantum optical literature. So depends on whom you talk to. Quantum optics people will say this is the squeezing parameter. The more electrical engineers who work with these down converters, they would call as the gain of the down converter, but the two are same things. So delta phi can be computed to have this form, and in the limit when alpha goes to 0, so there is an extra contribution here which I didn't write it. So when alpha goes to 0, that is the contribution that remains here. So you get the result which originally was found by Yorke et al. This is Yorke et al.'s result, and what you find here, the sine hyperbolic square r is the number of spontaneously generated photons by each down converter. So if sine hyperbolic square r is the average number of photons produced by each down converter, then this quantity is of the order of n square and so delta phi is of the order of 1 over n. So which is the Heisenberg limited sensitivity. And for the stimulated one, you improve this to this form. So where one takes advantage of both the sensitivity that you can have with the classical source as well as with the quantum source. Classical part of the contribution is contained in this term and the quantum part is contained here. So these kind of SU11 interferometers can give you much better sensitivity. And Jeff Wu at IUPUI, he had just reported an experiment in the Applied Physics Letters on the sensitivity of these kind of interferometers. Okay, let me mention this without discussing it in detail. And this has to do with the whole subject of quantum sensors, and I have just put it in a nutshell on this slide. So let's first think of a simple scattering problem. We have a scattering medium here, and you send light beams, say laser light, on the scattering medium, and it's going to be scattered. And you look at the scattered light, and by looking at the properties of the scattered light, you derive information on the scattering medium. So that's a fairly standard method of deriving information on the scattered medium by doing light scattering. Now, people do inverse problem, and people ask the question when they do the inverse problem that how much information I can get about my scatterer by doing this light scattering. So suppose you were to ask a question, by just looking at the scattered data, can I reconstruct the shape of the scatterer, right? If you can reconstruct the shape of the scatterer, then you have complete information about the scatterer. So unfortunately, there are number of limitations, because what really happens that the intensity of the scattered light is proportional to the Fourier component of the scattering potential. And since you are doing experiments in far zone, so there is a mathematical literature that you know what are the possible Fourier components that you can detect by doing measurements in the far zone. And it again turns out that the Fourier components which you can detect, they are limited by this relation. So again you get something like a Rayleigh criterion that how much information you can get about the scatterer. So there have been a lot of literature and lot of work that how one can go beyond this limit and can get more information about the scatterer. My colleagues, when I was in PRL, they used to look at the atmosphere, they used to do sensing of the atmosphere, what is called a LIDAR. So they will send a laser beam to the atmosphere, and with a telescope they would then collect back the scattered light, and by looking at the properties of the scattered light, they had computer codes to drive information about the aerosols in the atmosphere. Distribution of aerosols at different heights in the atmosphere. So here is a kind of display what you can do with entangled photons. Since what we have seen in our morning's discussion, with entangled photons you can do something better. So basically the idea would be that you send your entangled photons on whatever your scatterer is, which could be like a target, and then you look at the scattered photons, and you could do a coincidence measurement of these scattered photons. And from whatever I discussed in the morning, it should be evident that if you do this kind of a setup, then you should be able to get much better information about the target or about the scattering medium. Different people like to call it target. I like to call it as a scattering medium. Okay, so that's the idea that when DARPA is funding projects on quantum sensors, that how the entangled photons can be used for doing sensing. Okay, I had mentioned in the beginning the magneto-optical rotation, and so let me just tell you what is magneto-optical rotation is. So what we do, we send, let's say, linearly polarized light. This is a linearly polarized light. It is sent through a medium, and a magnetic field is applied in the medium. This magnetic field is along the direction of propagation of the laser light. So laser light is propagating this way, and the magnetic field is also applied in the same direction. And this could be a sample of, let us say, atomic vapor. So the magnetic field defines the quantization axis. And what happens that this linearly polarized light, its plane of polarization rotates due to this applied magnetic field on this system, and at the output you can measure how much the direction of polarization has rotated, and the amount of rotation is proportional to this applied magnetic field. So what happens here, suppose you think of the atomic system as a simple system like this, where you have one relevant excited state, and these are the lower levels. So this we would call as J equal to 0 to J equal to 1 transition. These lower levels are split by this applied magnetic field, M equal to -1, M equal to +1, M equal to 0. And the incoming light is linearly polarized. So a linearly polarized light can be written as a combination of two circular components, E plus and E minus. So what will happen that the population in the state m equal to -1 can go to this state by using the E plus light or the sigma plus polarized photons, and this one can use the sigma minus photons. Now notice that the frequency of transition for this is different than the frequency of transition for this. So as a result, what happens that the optical absorption is different for the two transitions. So which is denoted by chi plus and chi minus. These are the susceptibilities for the plus transition and minus transition, and these two are different because one has applied a magnetic field. And the difference between these two to lowest order in the magnetic field is proportional to the magnetic field. So this rotation in the polarization is proportional to the magnetic field, and so when you measure the intensities of the x component or y component, they would again go like cosine square phi by 2 or sine square phi by 2. So measurement of these quantities gives you phi, and because phi is proportional to the magnetic field, this becomes, this system, the Faraday rotation, is a sensor for the magnetic fields. So that is the idea, that this is a sensor for the magnetic fields. And the sensor is a good sensor if you can measure this phi precisely with high sensitivity. So we are again back to the problem of interferometry in a sense, that we want to measure phi with high sensitivity. So the idea again would be that we replace this laser field. Instead of using a laser field, you use a source of entangled photons. And because the whole thing is like an interferometer, so from the discussion that we had, it would be clear that if you use the entangled photons here, you will use the sensitivity of the measurement of phi or the sensitivity of the measurement of the magnetic field. So actually we tried this out. This is a theoretical result that we use this non-collinear down converter. So we produce these entangled photons. So the state of the photons which comes in here is an entangled state, and we set up things here in a slightly different way. So what we do, we take light coming out on this port, sort of send it from the backward direction. This part is sent in the forward direction, and what this scheme does, it's a clever scheme to get rid of certain unwanted terms. I mean, in principle we could have sent both of these in the same direction, but then we would also get some unwanted terms. But in this particular scheme, when we send it, they from the backward direction and this in the forward direction, and you do this coincidence measurements, you find, for example, that the 4-photon detection probability becomes cosine square 2 phi. So you have an improvement in phi measurement by a factor of 4. So the magneto-optical rotations can be measured to a much higher accuracy by using entangled source of photons. Okay, so from the discussion that we had so far, it's clear that it depends that how you set up your detection scheme. What kind of observables you are going to measure, in the experiment. So So there have been newer ideas, and one of the idea was that we measure the parity. So parity in our context would mean, for the case of photons, this is e to the power I pi a dagger a. This is the observable representing the parity operator, because if you work with the number state, it is e to the power I pi n, which is equal to minus 1 to the power n. So you would like to measure parity, and why parity? Because it turns out that so again back to Mach-Zehnder interferometer, and at the output, instead of measuring the intensity would be mean value of a dagger a. We measure the mean value of e to the power I pi a dagger a. And the calculations show that this measurement of the parity can yield the Heisenberg limited sensitivity. The noise, because this is a parity operator, noise is very easy to compute. If we call this as pi, so pi square anyway is 1, and so if experimentally you can detect this quantity, then you can easily calculate the noise and the sensitivity. Okay, so if you decide to make a measurement of parity, then again you can reach the Heisenberg limited measurement. But now we have a difficulty. How do we measure parity? Because we don't really have photon number resolving detectors. The group in Boulder, they have built a photon number resolving detectors which works for a smaller number of photons, and that works only in the microwave domain. So that is the only number resolving detector that we know of so far. So now the question is that even though parity measurement is so nice, can we come up with an idea which would measure the parity of the radiation field? And so what we found then, that we can carry out indirect measurement of parity by measuring the Wigner function of the radiation field. And Raymer's group in early 90s, he developed an experimental method. Actually, he implemented a proposal by Riskin for the measurement of the Wigner function. So, well, let me define what the Wigner function is, since many of you may not know. So, just like in the in classical statistical physics, you introduce a phase space distribution. The phase space distribution is a distribution of position and the momentum variables. Wigner introduced a function for a quantum system which is a joint distribution function of the position and the momentum variables. But since we know that we have to satisfy the Heisenberg uncertainty relation, therefore we cannot have a distribution which would have all the properties of a probability distribution. So Wigner function, sometimes people like to call it as a quasi distribution. Because this function can be negative, unlike the classical distributions. And the negativity of the Wigner function is typically due to the fact that in quantum mechanics Q and P cannot be measured at the same time. So the way it is defined, you take the expectation value of this object and then you take a Fourier transform of this. Alpha is a complex variable and take a Fourier transform of this. That defines the Wigner function. And as I said, that we know today how we can measure the Wigner function in the lab. So it turns out that if W is the Wigner function, the value of the Wigner function at the origin, so that's when alpha is 0, the value of the Wigner function at the origin is directly proportional to the expectation value of the parity. Okay, so this is very nice because we don't have the photon number resolving detectors. So even without the photon number resolving detectors, we can measure the parity provided we implement this scheme of Ramer to measure the Wigner function. Okay. Now there is a whole class of radiation fields for which the situation is even much simpler, and this class corresponds to the case when the Wigner distributions are Gaussian in nature. So here is a Wigner function with a Gaussian property. So it's quadratic in alphas, and tau and mu are related to the expectation values of A square and mean photon number and so on. And because the uncertainty relation has to be satisfied, so there are restrictions on this parameter, tau square minus 4 mu square. So for such a class of states, and fortunately the light which is produced by a down converter has the Wigner function of this form, has a Gaussian Wigner function. So for such a class, this parity operator is going to reduce to just this simple quantity, and therefore it only means that if we can measure tau, and tau is related to the mean number of photons, and this quantity u is related to this expectation value of A dagger square. So we basically need to have two measurements, one measurement for the mean photon number and another measurement for this quantity u, and it's now fairly standard in quantum optics to make a measurement of this quantity u by using the technique of homodyne measurements. So homodyne measurements measure this quantity U. And what is a homodyne measurement? You say, suppose here is the radiation field for which you want to measure this quantity U, then you mix this radiation field with a known classical source. And after mixing this with the classical source, you measure again the photon number. Okay, so the measurement of the photon number after mixing with the classical source gives you this quantity U. So the homodyne technique is fairly standard. Measurement of the number of photons is fairly standard. So by using the standard techniques, you get these two parameters, which gives you this quantity, which in turn gives you the measurement of the parity. So the problem is completely solved, though we have not made the technological advance in producing the single photon detectors. Okay, so that's another thing, that by using the parity, you can again reach the Heisenberg limited sensitivity of measurement. Okay, so now I want to spend little time on this new degree of freedom which the electromagnetic fields possess, and this is the orbital angular momentum of the electromagnetic field. And I mean, people who work with the classical information processing using electromagnetic fields, all the work is based on the polarization degrees of freedom associated with the electromagnetic field. But in last couple of years, the orbital angular momentum is being fully explored, first in the context of classical information processing, and now in the context of quantum information processing. You know, things like Hongu-Mendel experiment has been repeated by a group in Netherlands recently, using the orbital degrees of freedom. So what are these modes? First, in the classical context, so we have two kind of modes. The typical modes which are produced by, the standard modes are what are called the Hermite-Gauss modes. The modes which possess the well-defined angular momentum, these are the Legere-Gauss modes. And these Legere-Gauss modes have this kind of a structure. Here is the Gaussian form, and here is the Legere part. So it looks very complicated structure. And there is a phase here, and the phase, it depends on x and y. Tan theta is y over x. So that's how the Legere-Gauss modes are defined. And these are the solutions of the two-dimensional Helmholtz equation in polar coordinates. So if any of you have solved the standard two-dimensional harmonic oscillator problem in polar coordinates, we usually do it in Cartesian coordinates, but if you have done it in polar coordinates, you would have seen something similar. Okay, so these are the electromagnetic beams which carry orbital angular momentum. The polarization of light is connected with the spin angular momentum. Okay, and so the total angular momentum associated with a light beam will have contribution from the orbital part plus the spin part. So the orbital angular momentum associated with this kind of beam is this quantity n minus m, which typically we write it as L. So L is the orbital angular momentum. They are also called the vortex beams, or we call these as optical field with singularities. And Michael Berry, he had a very comprehensive paper on on beams with the singularities. Okay, so in the very simple case, corresponding to L equal to plus minus 1, you have this kind of a structure, x plus I by this, x minus I by. The standard HG beams have a structure like x this or y times this. And these are the special combinations of the HG with the phase factor I or the phase factor minus I. So now you can imagine that if you are looking at these class of beams with the orbital angular momentum, then you have a situation which is very similar to what you have with polarization. You have two circular polarizations. Here in this case, you have two values of the orbital angular momentum, L equal to plus 1 and minus 1. And so many of the concepts that one has used in the context of polarization can be used in this context. And more mathematically, when we talk of Poincare sphere or you talk of a Bloch sphere, that's an SU2 group. So in this special case, you have another SU2 group which corresponds to the orbital angular momentum. So you can also produce entangled states of the orbital angular momentum, and there are actually holographic techniques and by using the holographic techniques you convert HG modes into LG modes. You can produce beams carrying with definite orbital angular momentum, and you can produce entangled states of the beams with orbital angular momentum. So let me just write down one of these states. Again by a down converter, by adding the holographic beams, holographic devices in between. So you can get an output state where you have signal photons carrying the orbital angular momentum L, idler photons carrying the orbital angular momentum minus L, and we have assumed that the down converter is pumped by a pump with zero orbital angular momentum. So there is a conservation of the orbital angular momentum here. Incoming value of L is 0, outgoing will be L minus L 0. And this is a entangled state involving the states of the orbital angular momentum. So in particular, if you pick up a given value of L here, this one can be written in this form, which is like an EPR state. So what I have demonstrated that you can produce the entangled states of the fields carrying orbital angular momentum. It's rather surprising that actually, that one has started using this extra another degree of freedom which the radiation field possesses very late in the game. So as I have illustrated here, you have the 2 photon entanglement. Now the orbit involving the orbital angular momentum degree of freedom. You can have a 4 photon entanglement as this diagram displays. So you have a photon with L, minus L, L, minus L, and combinations of this kind. So you can produce a variety of states, entangled states, using again the down converter, and now you can think of applications. So I had a postdoc, Anand Jha, who was a student of Robert Boyd at Rochester, and he did all these kind of calculations. That, for example, the question of supersensitive measurements of the angular displacements. So if you want to measure the angular displacements, it is best to use states with orbital angular momentum. And again, this one gives you sensitivity which is like short noise limited. So this is the one with an input state, entangled state, and you have a different level of sensitivity. You have this extra factor here, 4. So that is the improvement in sensitivity that one gets if you use the entangled states. Okay, so you can go on with in this game and can produce lot of interesting results. And the final few minutes I want to spend on a different class of interferometer. These are called as the Ramsey interferometers. So Ramsey discovered this in the context of microwave spectroscopy in 1950, because he was interested to find out again how he can improve the sensitivity of his measurement. So Ramsey came up with a very clever idea, and let me illustrate this idea. Say in the context of atoms. So let's say we have an atom which is in the ground state, and we bring a pulse of light, and we apply this pulse of light for a time tau, and under the action of this pulse some population will go to the excited state and the remaining population will remain in the ground state. So you calculate what is the population in the excited state and the population in the excited state has this kind of a behavior depending on the duration of this pulse, and what is plotted here on the x-axis is the frequency of the atomic transition minus the frequency of this laser field. So this probability is being examined as a function of the detuning. And basically what one is trying to measure, that what is the frequency of the atomic transition, and you want to have a measurement of this frequency of atomic transition. Okay. So clearly the accuracy of the measurement, which would be determined by the width of these curves, and the width of these curves, it depends on the duration tau. Okay. So here is Ramsey's original idea. So we have the atom coming in the ground state, we apply a laser pulse here, then we wait for some time interval, capital T, and we apply a second laser pulse here. And now we look at this probability, or what is the population in this state. And this population now has this behavior, the blue curve. And the dashed curve was the result when you did not apply this field. So the dashed curve is the result of this measurement. So the new method that Ramsey discovered, that by using two separated laser fields, this time interval t is bigger than this duration of the pulse. In that case, you have this behavior, and if you look at the central peak, this is much narrower compared to the width of this dashed curve, and therefore you have much more sensitive measurement of the frequency of atomic transition, depending of course on the value of this time difference t. Now there is an experimental limitation on t, because you can't make t to be too large. If you make the t to be too large, then lot of decoherence effects start setting in. So you would like to use a value of t which is smaller than the decoherence time scales for this problem. Okay. So Ramsey method has been used very, very extensively in microwave spectroscopy, and in 80s and 90s, both Cohen Tanuji and John Hall, they started using the Ramsey method in the context of optical transitions, and it's very popular now with the experimentalists. Okay. Now this Ramsey method, this can be thought of as an interferometer, and that's what I have displayed on this slide, that why this is an interferometer. So if you look at this picture, so what I have displayed here, that supposing this field puts the atom in the excited state, so then this is the transition amplitude to the excited state, or the ground state part can go up to here, and then it can go to the excited state by the second beam. This extra factor comes because there is a time evolution in between these two fields. So if you now look at the total excitation amplitude, there are two quantum paths which are contributing to the total excitation amplitude, and if there are two quantum paths, they ought to interfere with each other. That's the basic premise of quantum mechanics. So we have an interference between these two quantum paths, and that's what leads to narrowing of the fringe pattern, or the Ramsey fringes. So that's why the Ramsey method is like another interferometer. It's an interference of two quantum paths which leads to much narrower interference fringes, and therefore better measurement of the frequencies. Okay. And well, I'm almost done. So we have looked at it. We have said, well, you take the Ramsey interferometer, and can we do still better by replacing these classical fields by entangled source of photons. Okay, so idea is to replace the classical fields by the entangled fields. And so as I had written earlier, that down converter, you have produced this A and B. These are the signal and the idler. and by combining these on a beam splitter, you can use this and this say one for this and this one for this. And if you do that, then the calculations show a further improvement in the resolution capability. So if you look at this curve, this summarizes everything. Here is again the atomic detuning, and the red curve here would be the one would be for the classical laser fields, and the blue curve would be the one with this kind of a source of entangled photons, and the yellow one is when you have only the single excitation zone, no interferences for the yellow one. And so if you compare the red one, which is with the classical fields, and the blue one, which is with quantum fields, you see a definite improvement in the resolution capability. Okay, so the ideas which I have described are quite generic, applicable to a large class of interferometers, both optical interferometers as well as the atomic interferometers. And I have been quite specific in emphasizing that the light sources that we use, these are the currently available light sources. Make use of the light which is produced by a down converter, which today is a standard source in any quantum optics laboratory in the world. The detectors that we use for all these calculations are again the standard avalanche detectors. So nothing exotic about the detection system, nothing exotic about the sources. But if you go and look at the literature, you will find lots and lots of theoretical papers with different kind of exotic sources and the exotic detection schemes. And so far it has been extremely difficult to realize experimentally many of those schemes. So that's why when we started working on this problem couple of years ago with several collaborators, we emphasized the point that we want to look at it with the practical systems as available today, both sources as well as the detectors. And since at lunch somebody asked me a question on the noon state, so I'll just make a comment. Go back to this slide that I had in the morning. Okay, so I've shown you this slide in the morning, and if you look at this part of the state, so I come in with this 2-2 state, and after the first beam splitter, we have this state as well as this state in the interferometer. Now, if we didn't have this state in the interferometer, and that's what would be just a noon state. So the term in this bracket is what's called a noon state, N-O-O-N. Some people call it nuon state, to distinguish with the English word noon. So, and this is noon because it's like a structure If it is n here, n0, 0, n. So this is the noon state in the interferometer, but then there is an extra term here. So you see, in my scheme of things, with the practical sources, I am not working with a noon state, because the state inside my interferometer is this, which is this part plus something else. And but I use this detection scheme to pick up certain particular contribution, 3, 1 and 1, 3. So I hope it answers the question which somebody asked about the noon state. Okay, so I think this would be a good point to stop, and if you have questions, you are most welcome to ask, and thank you for your attention. Oh, by the way, maybe I should show this, because a lot of the material that I discussed, I put it in my book, which has come out about a month ago. So maybe you are too tired. Okay.
Just the light wave propagate to atmosphere. The light is scattered.
No,
So photon is scattered.
Light is scattered.
Photon is scattered. How the scattered photon is entangled the photon?
No. Ordinary standard experiments, we send from a laser source, and for the telescope we collect the scattered photons. I suggest you go to Mount Abu, look at our setup there, that where we have a telescope and a very powerful laser beam that goes in the atmosphere, and we collect it. And normally all these LIDAR experiments, when they want to probe the atmosphere, they are always set up at some mountain. In Germany, if you go, there is a Zugspitze mountain where they have set up the experiment. Because you want to reach the atmosphere, you want to go 100 kilometers up, and you want to monitor what's happening in the atmosphere. Now I am saying that instead of using the classical sources, if you send the entangled photons in this, if the incoming these two photons are entangled with each other, when they are scattered, certain degree of entanglement is going to remain between those two photons. And if you measure what is the degree of entanglement which is remaining, that would be a measure of this object which is scattering the photons.
In Ramsey's interferometer, we apply 2 pulses.
Right.
Suppose we apply 3, 4, more than 2 pulses. What happens?
What happens? You can calculate it, and people in fact have done even the experiments with more pulses, but right now I don't have a ready-made answer for you. Yeah. Right.
Are there anything like in SU11 algebra? Are there any physical system which map like SU2 generator
exactly.
and two-level system?
Down converter is a physical system. As I kept on telling, that this is something which is there in everybody's lab. And if you look at what a down converter does mathematically, right? You have an input field, you have an output field. So you want to relate the output field to the input field, and in quantum mechanics, you are going to relate the Heisenberg operators associated with the output field to the Heisenberg operators of the input field. And this transformation between the input and the output Heisenberg operator is mathematically a Bogoliubov transformation, which is a characteristic of any SU11 group. Okay, so it's a physical system where this particular symmetry, group symmetry, is easily realized.
And what is the significance of writing 1, comma 1? Because in SU2, the number of generated 2 square minus 1. So, what is the significance of writing this 1, comma 1?
1 comma 1, what is the significance? I forget. Maybe you can answer this better.
Mathematically, what is called an involutive automorphism of the group. It comes with, you put an I with one of the generators, that makes it non-compact, non-compact.
Yeah, the algebra is different here. Angular momentum algebra, in one of the commutators you change sign, to get the SU11 algebra. Yeah, yeah. Yes, it is indeed. It makes use of the Meissner effect that the superconducting state kind of becomes a normal state, and since that happens at a very, very low intensity levels, and so that's why it works with only few photons at the most.
It's something like this hot spot, right? That you have a photon and then that spot turns not superconducting and that acts as...
Yeah, that's right. And it's in microwave domain because it's a superconducting system. Yeah, my pleasure.
Your question.
Minus 4 to the n. For 1 qubit, there is 12 parameters. So, and then I'm going to go on the board and explain so that you have an idea of where it's coming from. Remember, we have this density matrix where we can write it in this way. And maybe I'm going to write this here. If we would have a pure state, a final pure state is related to the initial pure state by a unitary transformation. And you remember there was 3 parameters in that case. And if we have a general density matrix, the evolution is given by this, where these things are called Krauss operators. And the question is how many parameters that we need to describe all the Krauss operators. So this is I for the initial. So from this, you know that the equation is linear. So instead of looking at this, I'm going to now, as I mentioned before, write density matrix as a vector, where this is how much of the unit operator, how much of the x operator, how much of the y operator, how much of the z operator that we have. So it should really be alpha, beta, and gamma. You might think that you should drop this and just look at the evolution of these operators, but I'll explain to you in a second that you cannot do this. So rho final is equal to a big matrix. Oh. So these will have 4 parameters describing this, 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 and this. And then we can think about this the rho initial, and let's call this the kind of transfer matrix, which goes initial, which gives you the final one. So the elements here, there'll be 4 of those here, 4 of those, 4 of those, when we multiply this to get this. So we have 16 parameters, okay, which is 4 to the 2n. And it's because in a Hilbert space with n qubits, it's a matrix of 4 to the n multiplied by 4 to the n. So we have 4 to the n. But there is a constraint because we want to preserve the trace. So what are these elements that comes in here? So these are elements, I'm going to write one of them as if the input is the unit density matrix, the output is the unit density matrix. This is this one. The one here is if the input is the unit density matrix, the output is going to be how much of X that we have here. So we want the density matrix to be, if it starts with unit, with a trace of rho is equal to 1, then we have normalized it here. So if we arrive here, we need to have this thing also be equal to the unit operator. Okay, so that the final density matrix would also be, so I should say this is the number 1, not an operator 1. So this has to be 1 at the corner there so that the trace is being preserved. This is a term of how much of X, the operator X, can turn into the unit operator. And it turns out that if this has a 1 there, this term here will have to be 0, this term here will have to be 0, this term here will have to be 0. And the other terms here are not determined. So there is 4 to the 2n minus 1 row of this, which is 4 to the n. And so for n equal to 1, you get 12 of those. You might have thought, oh, maybe because this is determined here, we can have only these terms that comes here. There would be 9. But you would miss something because when you start with a, let's say, a totally mixed state 1, you might have process which turn this density matrix into something which looks like, let's say, 1 plus some alpha x or some y or some z. An example of this is if you have the totally mixed state, and then we have the Hamiltonian that you've seen in an MR, and you leave it to relax. Then suddenly some z terms are going to appear in there because the Hamiltonian is the form z, but if you have something else, you have something else. So this is the answer to the problem of how many parameters that you need to characterize the evolution of 1 qubit, which is surprising because most of the time I've asked the question to many people, and the first person that I've asked this to was Peter Shor, and he failed. So that was not an easy one to answer. But I've challenged you on this. Out of these 12 parameters, I mentioned that 3 of them correspond to unitary transformation. So there's 9 parameters which are left in here, which correspond to non-unitary evolution. And in NMR, we give 2 parameters, T1 and T2. And in fact, we give also the temperature implicitly. So there's 3 numbers in there that we've given. And so there's 6 of them which are not included. And why is that? Anybody wants to make a guess? Yeah, and which symmetry? So, no, it's not a selection rule. You remember we have a big magnet, with a big magnetic field in the z direction, and makes the system rotate around the z direction very fast. And at a time scale which is faster than all the other interaction we have around. So we don't get terms which looks like the x or the y's. And if you go and take rid of them, what you'll have is only kind of some z terms there. And this is the reason why you don't have this. So in terms of the Bloch sphere, what are all these parameters? Well, I gave you a hint when I talked about T2 and T1 in the lecture, that if you start with the ball, the sphere, instead of pure state, and you have decoherence, only the T2, then the sphere gets like this kind of American football, where 0 and 1 are preserved, but all the other states get shrunk on one way. So that's one example. But if you would have a generic evolution like the one that's here, what you get is a football, but in some other kind of weird direction. And you need 3 parameters to say where is the center of that football. You need 3 parameters to give what are the axes of this football. And then you need 3 other parameters. Once you have this kind of axis with the longer one, where is it pointing? So you need 3 parameters for this. So you have these 9 parameters, and this whole thing can rotate in some way, which gives you the other 3 parameters. So you have a geometric picture of those, how that's work. Should point out one thing is that here I said the only constraint we have was that the trace of rho is equal to 1. There's also that this map is completely positive. But this will not tell you that some rows are 0 and 1, but certain parameter here will have some kind of inequality in them. And an example of this is that although we can have a map which takes the block sphere and make it into a line like this, extreme case of decoherence, where the off-diagonal terms go exactly to 0 and the sphere becomes to a line, we cannot have something which goes to a disk. This would violate positivity of the map. So there are some of these that are not physical, and they're not hard. They're not easy to kind of figure it out, but positivity is one of them. So to come back on the symmetry here of T1 and T2, if you have something in here which is rotating very fast around the z-axis, that means that all the parameters has to be symmetric with respect to this. So what you're left with is the location of this ellipse and then how much it has shrunk, which correspond to the T1 and the T2. Okay? Now you've learned something.
Professor Lafayette, what's the measure of this impossible transitions? Impossible transitions, impossible maps.
And you're asking what is the measure? By this, how many of them are?
Exactly. Has this question been addressed? Since it's not. Yes.
Some of the early work which was done by George Sudarshan and Kossakovsky and by Lindblad, they wrote an evolution of the density matrix, and they said that this evolution has to be described by a semi-group, and if you describe the evolution by a semi-group, they were able to construct what exactly all these Crouch operators should be, and they could explicitly write down the density matrix equation not only for a two-level system but for a multi-level system. And if you look at the structure of their density matrix equation, which appears both in the work of Sudarshan and Kossakovsky as well as Lindblad, you see the number of parameters which appear in such an evolution, which maintains positivity of the density matrix as well as the trace condition. So the answer is well known. You have to go and look at the papers of Kossakovsky and Sudarshan.
The aim of a perfect quantum computation is to have unitary operations. So there is no noise, right?
You can think of most algorithms use unitary transformation, but if you want to do simulation of quantum physical system, then you might well want to introduce some non-unitary evolution also. So in general, you have both kind of evolution in your toolkit. In fact, when you do something like a measurement, this is a very non-unitary evolution, right?
What is the first thing you would do with it?
I would check if it works. Okay, so, and do other people know if I have built that quantum computer? If people don't know, I'm going to go and break some codes. And then I won't have to worry about my retirement. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go there. I think my retirement doesn't hurt anybody, or would hurt much less number of people. But after that, I think I would be interested in simulating some quantum physics system. For example, looking at some of the Hamiltonian in condensed matter, and in particular, high TC superconductivity, and see do they produce superconductivity or not. So this is one example of what I would do. Example in chemistry also of trying to see, can we understand larger atoms, binding of atoms together, trying to look at that part, material science problem that would be the problem we'd be interested in.
Way these computers are being used nowadays is mostly for searching huge number of databases. Okay, the information is just exploding all over the place, and it's not that we want to do something, but most of the time we are just trying to find something which is already there. And just like Google does its job, what the quantum computers will be heavily and widely applied in many different areas, basically search problems. And Grover's algorithm from that point of view is going to be very important.
Which would use quantum effects. And what I have in mind is a little bit naive, but suppose that you have, so I have a teenager son who kind of works at these games, and so there would be one of these Star Wars fight between these fighters, but suddenly you can start to use quantum effects. So if you send your jet towards these two slits, suddenly there'll be some places where your jet is not going to appear because it is going to interfere. And the goal of this quantum game would be for young people to learn about quantum mechanics without having to solve all these equations that we've seen on the board. So build their intuition of how quantum effects can work and how they can be used in completely different contexts. And once we succeed in doing this, then everybody will have a quantum computer in their pocket to do something. That'd be video games or other things.
Mechanical, and probably in Science Report or somewhere it was reported that I mean they have also built a simulator for this. I mean real simulator, not just computer one, where some laser pointer acts as a golf and you are to play. Learning algorithms, especially for artificial intelligence, and how does build various model, how does human mind works, and especially the age-old myth how human brain works. That's a cynical.
Solver has a lot of degrees of freedom and is highly nonlinear, but there might be moments where linear extrapolations start to work. So you'd look for, I'd take a set of indicators, look at how they're changing, try to always continuously try to fit it to a linear model, fail most of the time. When it works, then I'd kick my quantum computer into action and use an observable that I know that I can efficiently simulate, check what its expectation value is, and bet accordingly.
Level quantum computer. 2 to 3 times. 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 2 to 3 ti at the moment, there is no indication that we'll be able to solve NP-complete problems on a quantum computer. In fact, it'll be very surprising. All the initial results that we have tell us that in order to go beyond what Grover search tells us, for example, you'd have to get some insight into these problems that we don't currently have. And those insights might even lead to a better classical algorithm for NP-complete problems, which we think is actually not the case. I mean, that they don't exist. So, I mean, in short, the answer is that the landscape probably looks like the following, where quantum computers solve certain problems that are difficult for classical computers faster than we can do classically, but they probably do not solve NP-complete problems efficiently.
Quantum computer to solve differential equations, it works in a linear regime because it makes use at the heart of the Kitaev phase estimation. So I don't see any way to make use of quantum computer for solving nonlinear differential equations.
I'm interested in ideas which are quantum inspired but really classical. They can be implemented in classical way. I'm aware of one of such theoretical applications in computer science. They are called holographic algorithms, which they look like quantum algorithms, but they are implementable classically, and they have solved so many open problems. But I want to know if there are some physical, not theoretical problems which are quantum inspired, but they can be implemented classically. Some interesting ideas that came from quantum mechanics or quantum computing, but can be implemented classically.
Tight binding Hamiltonians in condensed matter physics, these, as we know, are quantum mechanical Hamiltonians. But by using the optical waveguide systems, you can simulate these tight binding Hamiltonians, whereas the optical waveguide systems are completely classical systems. So when you look at the corresponding, equations for the wave amplitudes, the structure of the equations for the wave amplitude happens to be identical to what you would get for a tight binding Hamiltonian from the Schrodinger equation. So a lot of work, in fact, has been done on those kind of systems using completely classical optical realization.
Many body problems, like quantum mechanics of many body problems, and there is a good approximation for the ground state of Hamiltonian called matrix product states, and they kind of can be done on the classical computer, but give good approximation for the ground state of generic Hamiltonian in one space, one time dimension, also tensor networks, which can be generalized into high dimensions. So I think this is a good example.
There are results in classical computation, in mathematics, and other areas where we are able to use techniques from quantum computation and quantum information to prove those results, which are entirely classical. So, although, well, it's of a different flavor than the question you asked, but there are advantages to studying this area, which are which come from completely other non-computational considerations. I mean, there are, for example, results in coding theory that we can prove using results in quantum information theory for which no other proof is known. So that's an example of use of quantum information techniques in mathematics.
My question is, in quantum mechanics, observables are represented by Hermitian operator. is the reverse is always true? If we have any Hermitian operator that can be realized experimentally always.
Can we create entanglement between two remote systems which are previously unentangled? Is there any procedure to create entanglement between two remote systems?
More, then it's hard to imagine interactions between remote systems. So, but you can do still entangle by projective measurement, and there have been several experiments that people have demonstrated.
That way we can create entanglement.
That's right, two remote systems by projective measurement.
You can create discord by only local operations.
Dr. J.S. Agrawal. Just can Wigner function be simulated? Actually, there was some time before a paper to you can use you can simulate the Schrodinger equation. That means you can, and Schrodinger equation involves two terms, so P and V. So, and here also actually Wigner function is the Fourier transform of X and P parameters. So can first part of the question is that can Wigner function also be simulated? In the sense like, okay, right now I will say that using some discrete, like using NMR system. So we have you will discretize the space in some states using NMR, quantize the state at some point using NMR, and then you can simulating what Schrodinger equation will do, that this momentum part, this potential part will give you some phase. So
yes, we can simulate. So I don't think your question is specific.
Not only I'm talking about analytical solution, that is, can you respond?
No, I'm not clear on the question. You're saying, right, so you have so you're saying consider the case of a sparse time dependent Hamiltonian. And in that case, we would say that the Hamiltonian at any moment of time has only a polynomial number of non-zero time-dependent functions as entries, right? Okay, I'm ready for the next part of the question.
I mean, you know, this being the last talk and the last session, I think we should end with a vote of thanks, because that is important. So on behalf of my co-organizer, Dr. Anindra Sinha, and myself, I wish to spend the next few minutes thanking this page of people. So it'll take 2-3 minutes, but I think it's worth it, because a lot of work has gone into it, and we deserve, you know, they deserve some individual thanking, right? So, well, first of all, of course, I would like to thank ICTS, the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, for its support, you know, financial and otherwise. I mean, otherwise the event wouldn't have happened. So, and of course, its director, Professor Spenta Vadia, who of course has been the big motivator behind organizing such a school. And yeah. Next, of course, comes the physics department of the Indian Institute of Science. This is the physics department where we are sitting currently, and Professor H.R. Krishnamurthy, who's the head of the physics department, and he has given us, you know, permission to use all the facilities of this department, which includes this auditorium, our coffee place, our lunch place, and everything, and we should be thankful for that. So the premises. Of course, you know, this is something that probably is not very well known, that this is probably the first time when we have had such an international school focused on just quantum information and quantum computing, with such a wonderful list of speakers from outside India as well. And so then, you know, so that is something that is, you know, I think it's a nice achievement that we've had, and we hope that we have such things in future as well. So the emphasis, of course, you know, has been on different approaches and techniques. We've heard of this other school which we had a couple of weeks ago, but that was only on topological insulators and a specific branch of quantum computing. But this, of course, we could devote to almost different branches and different schemes of achieving something, and that is something I think worth mentioning. Okay, so, and we believe that we've had a very successful school. It's up to you to decide whether we've been successful or not. But I, for one, definitely think that this has been a nice school. And of course, the credit for this would first of all go to the lecturers. Because, what is a school if we don't have these wonderful motivating lectures that we've had over the last 3 days? And so Professor Ramola Flam, Professor Stephen Lyon, Professor Barry Sanders, Professor G.S. Agarwal, and of course Professor Ashwin Nayak. I wish we could thank Professor Thomas Genuine, who's probably now at the airport. So we'll have to have another school to hear about quantum communications and QKD from him. So thank you for such motivating and informative lectures. And hopefully we have lots of people here who now want to seriously pursue this field. Then that brings us, of course, to the participants. Thank you for being here, for your questions, and I hope, that's what I said, that I hope your interest in the field has only grown after this school. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the ICTS staff, especially Dipali Shivale, who's not here right now, but then, Ananda and I have been organizing it on an academic level, but then there's a lot of work that has gone into organizing various other aspects, and Dipali has been instrumental in that. And then, of course, our local advisors, especially Professor Apurva Patel, who was here till 5 minutes ago, but then, he has been like the patriarch in the organization of the school, and his help was, of course, very, very important. Then I would go on to thank all the volunteers. Kartik Joshi, can you raise your hand as I saw? Yeah. Rahul Sawant, Reena Sayani, Sunny Saurav is picking up Thomas Genuine right now. Pawan Naingar, Karandeep Singh, who was here somewhere, okay. Amit Kumar, Mitra, and Venu, who was also here. And then our projector in charge, D. Prabhakar, and Sarvanan Kumar. Of course, that was a very important aspect to the school, managing the projectors. Regarding the volunteers, of course, you've been instrumental in the smooth running over the last 3 days, but then a special thanks to some of you who you know who you are, who went for those and organized those crazy airport pickups at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. with delayed flights and cancelled flights, and so I think that deserves a special mention. Okay, so I think I've gone through the entire list. Ananda, will you agree with me? Because usually he comes up with something or the other that I've missed, so no? Okay, not this time, so I've done a good job. So to celebrate our quantum leap of knowledge, we will convert our food for thought to delicious food at the banquet, okay? And that is happening this evening, so you know that you're all cordially invited to this banquet, which is happening at 7 p.m. 7 p.m. at the Jawaharlal Nehru Center lawns. Yeah, so I'm sure if you walk down the road, you'll reach, but then I don't think that's how you should do it. So the volunteers should know how to reach the venue. So then the students, should hang around a little, and maybe some of the lecturers will still be around. You could ask more questions or whatever. And then you should accompany them to the venue. The volunteers should go with them, I think, so that you don't get lost, especially the outstation students. I'm not sure. So is the bus still outside? If you have a bus, then we could just use that to... so we'll just figure that one out. Yeah. So I think some of the lecturers have already mentioned that they actually want to go walking. Ray was one of them. And you're not going to be here, unfortunately. Yeah. But then, so if Ashwin and Steve... so we'll just decide this. If you want to go walking, then you can start walking from CVH at 6:45. And I would... Yeah, a little earlier, and I would say that maybe Rahul and Kartik, you guys could be at CVH at that time to accompany them to the right lawns. And if you want to take a car, that's also going to be available. So then we should all meet again at the lawns at 7 p.m. Yeah, the students. Yeah, the students or the lecturer. Yeah, if you're leaving from here, I mean, it's hardly possible. Yeah, from here. No, here and CVH are not quite the same. Okay. Okay. No, Yeah, it's not that many lectures. We'll just figure this out individually. But for the students, it's important. So if you want to walk, you should walk with one of these red tagged people, so that you reach the right place. And I think the bus is still there, so we could also have the bus take them at 6:30 or something.
For the students, the bus is going to leave from the banquet place at, what was it decided, 10 o'clock? No, 9:30, to take you back to UTC.
I think that's it. So thank you very much, and see you again at the banquet. Yeah.